Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Hen Talks series. My name is Tom Julian, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement, Career and Professional Engagement in the Office of Development and Alumni Relations. I'd like to thank you all for registering for today's event. We have a great presentation for today's session. Hen Talks is a webinar series that will run throughout the year featuring alumni, faculty, staff, and friends of the university. Each speaker will discuss a topic they feel is important to students and alumni in regards to career and professional development. All Hen Talks will be recorded and can be accessed by visiting the Hen Talks page of UD Connection or by viewing the resources on our UD Career Acceleration Network platform. A few items before we get started. If you have questions that you would like to have answered throughout the presentation, please type them into the chat box. Or if you may have any questions to myself or the presenter, you may type those in the Q&A. And then we will address this at the end of the session. We encourage you to keep the conversation going on social media by using the hashtag HenTalks. Lastly, if there are any technical issues as a viewer of this webinar, please contact UD's IT Support Center at consult@udel.edu or by phone 302-831-6000. Now, I would like to introduce our presenter, Bridget Scanlon, who is currently the Assistant Director of Undergraduate Professional Development at Temple University's Fox School of Business. In addition to her current role, Bridget has been working as a career coach for 2 years, in addition to bringing 9 years of experience to the field of education to her role, with a background in classroom teaching, curriculum development, and education consulting in universities and K-12 schools. She has received a master's degree and a bachelor's degree from the University of Delaware as well. This webinar is titled Beat the Bots, Crafting an ATS-Friendly Resume. So without further ado, I would like to open the floor to our presenter, Bridget Scanlon. Welcome and thank you for presenting today, Bridget.
Hi, thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with Hens and Friends. And as Tom said, I do work here at Temple, but I miss and love my University of Delaware, so I'm really happy to be on the phone with all of you today. So the reason that I chose this topic for today's presentation is because probably the number one challenge that I hear from my coaching clients is this constant experience of applying for jobs online and not hearing anything back. And so this presentation is kind of trying to get at the root of one of the causes of that issue, which is that the future is automation. Just like with any other field, the job search is done automatically through technology. And so when people have access to what that technology is looking for in resumes, they can tend to be a little bit more successful. So I'm hoping this presentation helps you out wherever you are in your job search process, and is something that you can use to tailor your resumes to be successful in the future. So the general structure for the presentation today is that we're going to start out with some resume basics. So just kind of using a shared common language around what some of the best practices are for writing a resume and making your resume stand out from the crowd. After that, we're going to go over a little bit about what ATS is, or Applicant Tracking Systems, and review kind of what that software looks like so that you have a better idea of how to use it in the future. After that, we're going to talk about some of the strategies that you can use to craft your resume to beat those bots, and then I'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So jumping right in, we'll start off with some resume basics. And the first thing that I do like to say when talking about resumes is take everything that I say here with a grain of salt. I'm going to give you the best of my knowledge and what I hear from employers, what they enjoy when they look at candidate resumes and what they like to see. But resume norms do differ across different fields and experience levels. And if you go to somebody for resume advice, you'll probably get slightly different advice from everyone. So what I'm sharing here is kind of general best practices, but you'll also want to check in with people that work in your field to see what they would recommend for you as well. So the main purpose of a resume is a really good place to start. And you may think you have an idea of what a resume is, but I think to have a shared discussion here, I like to start with the purpose of a resume being that you're looking to get an interview. So I'm going to transition here for one moment. I'm hearing that some of the audio is a little bit fuzzy, so I'm going to try to switch to a different format here. So let me know if you hear it any differently.
All right, so switching to this other type of audio, please feel free to keep sending messages if that is better or worse. And Tom, feel free to send me an email or something like that if you have any more feedback, because that's how I saw it the first time.
Hey, Bridget, it sounds great.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, everyone. So going back, we're going to talk about the purpose of a resume. You were able to visually see it, but the purpose of your resume is to get you an interview, right? So instead of talking about your entire professional history on one page, or trying to just summarize everything that you've done in the past and squeeze it all into a short space, like a biography, what you're really trying to do with your resume is get your foot in the door and make the employer curious enough to get into the room with them for an interview. So keep in mind that while you spend a lot of time writing your resume, recruiters only spend an average of about 6 seconds looking at it. So this means that your resume is going to have to be clear and easy to navigate, and very easy to understand in a short period of time. And then you can go into more details about your experiences when you get in the room. All right, so a few of the details about a resume that can be helpful for you as you're writing it are further definitions of what a resume is. So what is a resume? To answer that question, as a starting point, a resume is a marketing tool to display your value to employers. So what I mean by that is that your value can come from any experiences that you've had in your life up to now. But it's up to you to communicate your value through how you describe your experiences. So just like any other type of writing that you do, be it creative writing or research papers, you want to think a bit about your audience when you're writing the resume, because your resume is a marketing tool for a specific audience. So the second thing that I'm going to put out there is that your resume should be a document that highlights how your experiences fit for a particular role. So your resume might look slightly different and adjust based on the audience that you're trying to attract. And lastly, your resume is not a professional history document. So what I mean by that is you don't have to include everything that you've done in your past. Your resume is going to be a collection of your best experiences to apply for a single position. So don't feel pressured to squeeze everything onto 1 to 2 pages. Next, we're going to focus in on what the resume sections are. And again, I'll leave some time at the end for questions. These are basics across any resume, but based on your field, you might need to shift these around a little bit. So, of course, you'll start with your name and contact info, probably the most important part of the resume so that you can get contacted about that interview. Secondly, it's optional to include a professional summary. So you'll see some people put a little bit of a narrative at the beginning of their resume that talks about some of their experiences and how they fit a role. That's certainly something that you can do, but typically that works best for people that are shifting their career into a new field and want to explain why their past experience fits for that job, or for people that have a very long professional history that need to give a really succinct summary of what that looks like. So for new professionals, I typically don't recommend this, but again, it's something you can play around with. Next, you'll have your experience section, which can be listed in a number of ways. You can include it as relevant experience, professional experience, work experience, or just experience. And that's going to be a summary of essentially any work experiences that you've had, potentially volunteer work that you've done, or if you're a new professional and you don't have a ton of work experience, you might include things like projects that you've worked on or leadership roles that you've had in professional organizations or student organizations. And next, you're going to have some combination of a skills section. So that section may include different certifications or licenses you've had, any foreign languages that you can speak, as well as technical skills. And sometimes this section is broken out into separate areas. So especially for folks that work in the tech field, your technical skills section might actually be at the very top of your resume under your contact info, and the rest of your skills may be towards the bottom. And you're also going to include your education. And again, this order may shift based on how far out of your education you are. If you're a current student or a recent graduate, your education may be at the top, but otherwise, oftentimes that goes closer to the bottom underneath your work experience. Some additional sections that you may choose to include on your resume include volunteer experience, activities and awards, any professional organizations that you're a part of, leadership experiences that you've done, or projects. You may also have an academic section if you've presented at any conferences or have some research experience to add. So a couple of resume rules to present. First, a few things that you should do with your resume. Generally speaking, it's recommended to use a 1 page per 10 years of work experience ratio. So if you are within 10 years of graduating your undergraduate degree, that means ideally you would have a 1 page resume. If you have 10 years plus of work experience, you may go on to a second page. I don't necessarily recommend doing more than 2 pages, even if you have more work experience than that, because again, recruiters only have a very limited time to review your resume, so you have to work on making it succinct and easy for them to navigate. Generally speaking, when you're writing your resume, typically you want to use reverse chronological order, meaning that you start with the most recent experiences towards the top. When recruiters read resumes, they tend to focus more on things that are closer to the top of the page. So your recent experiences are going to be given a little bit more focus if you have them towards the top. For every experience that you list, whether it's a job experience, leadership, or volunteer position, typically you'll include 3 to 5 bullets. So if you don't feel like you have enough to say to have 3 bullets about an experience, you may consider taking it off. I do often see, especially for folks that have been in the same position for a while, the tendency to include more than 5 bullets because they're trying to describe everything that they've done in a job. Keep in mind, this is a marketing document, so you're just going to pick and choose the best of what you've done that's most relevant for the job you're applying for and include that in the bullet section. If you have had more than 1 job at a specific employer, you can consider listing those jobs separately. And so you get 3 to 5 bullets per position that you've had at that employer. So that gives you a little bit more space to talk. Again, you're going to tailor that resume on each position, and I'll show you some tools for doing that. So maybe about 80% of your resume stays the same across the board. But then as you're applying to different jobs, you're going to try to integrate what those jobs are looking for and the language that you're using to describe your experience. You also do want to review some resumes from your field, so take a look online and see if you can search for resumes for folks that have similar experiences as you, because it can help you to get some inspiration. You want to make sure that you focus on results for your resume, as opposed to just kind of listing out the different job responsibilities that you've had. So I'll show you some tools for doing that. You also want to be very specific when describing what your responsibilities are, and whenever possible, including quantitative data. So you may include some numbers and figures along with your responsibilities. Lastly, and this one can be challenging depending on what program that you're using, you want to make sure to be very consistent with your formatting. If all of your dates on your resume are aligned to the right of the page, making sure to keep that consistent throughout so that it's really easy for the recruiter to know how to navigate it. If you're bolding all your job titles, just make sure to keep doing that. And a couple of don'ts on here as well, things to avoid. Again, don't write it like a professional history or like a job description. Write it more like a marketing document where you're selling yourself for a specific job. Don't try to squeeze too much onto one space, meaning 1 to 2 pages. Just give the highlights. Make sure that you're always being truthful with what you include, and make sure that you're very diligent about double checking for typos or errors. Sometimes if there's one spelling mistake on a resume, that means that you're not getting an interview. So that's a really simple way to make sure that you're staying on track. Typically, you don't include any hobbies, photos, or personal information about yourself on a resume, sticking just to the professional. You usually don't list references directly on your resume because if the employer wants to know who your references are, they'll request that separately. And this real estate of this 1 to 2 pages is precious, so you don't need to waste it putting down people's names and phone numbers. And lastly, we don't usually recommend that people use pronouns like I, we, or my on their resume. It's kind of phrased almost like a job description where you're starting with action words first. So I'll show you a couple examples of how resumes could look. And again, this is going to differ pretty heavily based on your field. If you are in a more scientific or more professional field, you might have a cleaner looking, more traditional resume. If you're in a design oriented or technology field, you may have a resume that's a little bit more fun and playful. So I'll show you 2 different versions of my own resume for different jobs that I've applied for. Here I have my first one, which is more of kind of a traditional education resume. As you can see, I mostly just focus on professional experience, skills, and my education is towards the bottom because I graduated a number of years ago. I do also have a longer 2-page resume since I'm about 10 years of work experience in. I also have another resume that's a little bit more fun and has a little bit more color that I use when I'm applying for jobs teaching yoga. So as you can see, some of the similarities here are that I consistently use the same amount of bullets. I'm using still clean formatting, similar section headers. But in addition, I've played with a little bit of color because that's kind of normal on a more design-oriented or a more fun field like yoga. And on the left resume, I used Microsoft Word. If you go into Microsoft Word, they have a number of templates that you can use on there and just plug into. And on the right, I used a Google Docs resume format. So there are tons out there that you can play with depending on the jobs you're applying for. And I also think that it can be equally useful to look at how shouldn't resumes look. And so this is one that I've created for a class that I teach. We have Mr. Marco Salazar here. So a couple things that you'll notice about Marco. This is a design heavy resume. And of course, for certain fields, that's okay. But some aspects of the design aren't really working here. For example, as you can see, Marco's using a lot of different types of fonts and different font sizes. So it just doesn't make it super clean or easy to navigate. Also, Marco has a picture on there, which we don't recommend because, well, for a number of reasons. But here in the US, it's not typical and it can also lead to employment discrimination. So you don't want somebody judging you based on how you look. In addition, Marco decided to add hobbies, and that's not necessarily typical for a professional resume for the business realm. I popped this one on here for fun. This is Gritty's resume. And you can see in the background, Gritty included a picture of himself, which is, again, not what we recommend doing. In addition, Gritty's using a lot of colors. He's using some outdated Microsoft Word art, including his AIM screen name. So obviously, these are some things that we wouldn't want to do. All right, moving right along, we're going to talk about how to write effective bullets. And this is what takes the most time when you're putting together your resume. So your first bullet is typically going to look a little bit different than the rest of your bullets for each employer, because this is the bullet where you're giving a context for what your job is. So at the beginning of that first bullet, you're going to give a big picture summary of your day-to-day work. And then in the second half of that first bullet, unless it's super clear through the name of your employer what your workplace is, you're also going to describe your workplace within that bullet. So here I've provided an example. So provided support to a 10-person marketing team analyzing new growth opportunities for an international furniture manufacturer. So this first half of the bullet is giving a big picture summary of the work that this person is doing. This is a marketing internship. So the person, most of their time is providing support to a team. And then the second half of the resume is this workplace, which is IKEA, an international furniture manufacturer. For the rest of your bullets, you want to make sure that instead of, again, phrasing it just like a list of your responsibilities, you're actually focusing on the value that you've added to your employer and selling yourself a bit through how you describe your work. So here are some bullets where you can highlight some achievements, projects that you've worked on, and value that you added. So I've included some questions here to help you out with that. Details and numbers such as who did you work with, how many people were you working with, what other type of numbers can you showcase? If you're in sales, you know, what sales goals were you able to meet or exceed? And then describing your best work. What are the moments at work that you were most proud of? What were things that you were complimented on by your employer? So some examples that I've included here show how you can do that. You can see that the second bullet includes, instead of just, you know, I provided a reference manual, this person's actually saying, here are the steps that I took and here's how long the manual was. So taking those bullets, just getting a bit more specific. And a couple more examples. You know, this presentation will be posted for later, so you can always come back and take a look. But some things that I want to highlight about what makes these bullets on this slide pretty effective. First of all, this person is starting with strong action words. And as you can see, if this was my resume, this would be a problem because I spelled words wrong. So again, make sure you're spell checking. Here, this person is making sure that they differentiate between the actions that they're describing. In addition, they're including quantifiable information like how many customer orders they were able to process and how many customers the business services. In addition, they're providing context in that first bullet of who their employer is and where they're working. So keep those 3 items in mind as you're double checking your own bullet points. All right, so we're going to transition now to talk a little bit about these robots that you need to beat, which are the ATS. So here I've included 2 names of softwares that are used, ATS softwares, that are very common, and I'll show you some screenshots of what those look like later. But just know that there are dozens and dozens of applicant tracking systems out there. So what are ATS? Applicant tracking systems are a type of software that act as a human resources database, meaning they organize applicants for a job. So if you work as a recruiter or as a human resources person, chances are that you're using ATS to help you be more effective at your job. They organize applicants and candidates in one simple place so that all of that information can be easily tracked and nobody slips through the cracks. And some benefits of this software, or these types of software, are that they speed up the hiring process for recruiters and managers. Some of the technologies that are used within ATS that make it really interesting and unique are the 2 following things. First of all, these technologies have the ability to use optical character recognition, meaning when they receive a document, they're able to scan the document and break apart what the different words and sections mean. So if you're sending in a PDF document, this software is scanning the words and breaking it up into different pieces, parsing it so that it can be analyzed. The second thing that an ATS software offers is keyword comparison. And we're going to talk about this when we're talking about how to beat the ATS system. Essentially, this software is capable of scanning your resume for keywords that are important to the hiring manager to be able to tell whether or not you would be a good fit for the job. A couple facts about ATS, and this is from Top Resume. A corporate job posting often receives upwards of 250 applications. So that makes it pretty impossible for a human being to sit there and scan each individual one. Of those 250 applicants, typically only about 4 to 6 are going to be contacted for an interview. So that makes it a little bit difficult to end up in that final pile of applicants, especially if you don't know how the software works or how to optimize your resume. 95% of large organizations use ATS as part of their recruitment process. So you're almost guaranteed, especially if you're applying for large employers, that you're going to run across these. Large companies can receive up to 75,000 resumes each week. So this software really helps out the recruitment side. But sadly, 75% of resumes will never be seen by human eyes. They get rejected right away from the software system. So in order to better optimize your resume, it can be helpful to learn how the software system works. And that way you can kind of tailor what you're working with to make it fit better. So just so you're aware, some of the things that applicant tracking systems can help out with are they do everything from the beginning to the end of the job search, including posting the job, marketing the job out to a number of different websites, importing applicant resumes, parsing the resumes into different pieces, and tracking candidates on behalf of a company. So if you're in the HR field, ATS is your best friend because it's essentially organizing everything for you. And this is what it actually looks like. Jobslight, one of the most popular ATS, this is what it looks like on the recruiter side. So this person, as you can see, is able to keep track of different interview schedules and who's going to be participating in those. They also have copies of different profiles of different applicants and a to-do list here. In addition, their list of different positions that they're hiring for is probably going to be pretty long, depending on the size of the company. They're able to track how many different applicants they have for different positions and whether to reopen it based on whether they've hit their numbers. And in addition, kind of a to-do list of evaluations that they have to fill out based on how things went with the candidate. These steps are going to be crucial for you to understand as you're applying for jobs, because at any one of these different steps, you may be taken out of the applicant pile. So here are the different steps that ATS takes to whittle down that applicant pile to a manageable number. First off, when you're actually applying for a job, you're answering questions on the application that may completely knock you out of the applicant pool. So a number of questions are included to try to exclude candidates from the very beginning. Some of those questions may include things like, what is your desired salary? If you give a salary number that's too high, your resume won't even be looked at because there may be another 200 people behind you that would be willing to take the job at a different pay scale. Number two, the second thing that an ATS does is that it takes your resume, parses it into pieces, recognizes and scans the resume, and basically organizes it into that software system. The third thing that it does is that the resumes get sent to the recruiter and the hiring manager so that they can look through the ATS and optimize different keywords differently for different applications. So they then go through the ATS to look at applicants. After that point, once those recruiters and hiring managers select which keywords are most important to them, they actually view any candidate resumes that fit. So they may review anywhere from 5 to 25 candidates for a specific job. After that, recruiters or hiring managers typically rate candidates. Some of these softwares make it easy enough that they can rate candidates on a 5-star scale right then and there in the software. And the last step is that the top candidates are contacted for an interview. So as you're looking at applying for a job, keep in mind what these steps are so that you don't get knocked out early in the process. Make sure that you're answering questions in a way that keeps you a competitive candidate. Make sure that your resume can easily be recognized and parsed, and we'll talk about some skills for doing that. And make sure that those keywords are clear throughout your resume. So the last thing that we're going to do today before I open it up for questions is, now that we have a basic understanding of how ATS works, you are empowered to make your resume fit what the bot needs you to do. So 62% of companies out there using applicant tracking systems admit that some qualified candidates are being automatically filtered out by mistake. And had they actually gotten that resume in their hands, they may have considered that person for the final job. Here are some tips that you can use to make your resume more friendly to the bots. The first thing that you definitely want to do is to tailor your resume to the job description for every job you apply for. So again, your resume will probably stay maybe 80 to 90% the same for every job you apply for, but as you're applying for individual positions, you want to sit down with that job description next to your resume and see if they match or how you can make them match more effectively. And so in this process, you're going to focus on incorporating keywords from the job description into your resume. The second thing that you definitely want to do is to keep your resume simple. By using a basic resume template or format, you're making it easier for the robot to parse your resume and to organize it effectively. So this means whenever possible, you want to avoid using tables, columns, or graphics, because sometimes the software is not sophisticated enough to read text within a different format. In addition, you want to try to use traditional fonts that are easy for this format to recognize. Sans serif is something that I've heard can be more effective because it's easier for the system to read. In addition, you want to use standard resume headings like education and experience, because when the software scans for that, they know how to parse the resume effectively. In addition, you want to make sure that you avoid putting key information into a header or a footer of the document. Sometimes certain resumes will put your contact information, for example, into the header of the page. You want to make sure that you're fitting that into the actual page itself, because otherwise the robot might not actually be able to see it. Another small tip that you can use is using long form language as well as acronyms, because certain softwares may be looking for long form, like Master of Business Administration, and others may actually be looking at your resume for MBA. So if you include both of those on there, you have a higher chance of getting your resume into the employer's hands. Lastly, you can try to utilize the docx format type because it can be easier read by the applicant tracking systems, unless you know that this system is PDF compatible. So this is kind of counterintuitive. I have up until recently been telling people to use a PDF format because you can make sure that your formatting stays consistent. But typically the applicant tracking systems can actually navigate docx a little bit easier. As a final exercise here, take a look at this job description for about 30 seconds. See if you might be able to identify some keywords that might show up through the applicant tracking system. What words would you want to put onto your resume from this job description? All right, so see if you can identify a handful, even if you haven't made it to the bottom of the page. So if I was applying for this job, typically what I will do is that I'll actually print out the job description and take a highlighter and highlight any words that I think might be part of the keyword on the applicant tracking system. So here we have a handful of them, things like marketing, financial or finance, mergers, acquisitions, right? And you can see that marketing actually shows up a few times throughout this job description. So you can tell that marketing is probably going to be an important one. While you're putting together your resume, take note of whether these words are included on there. Perhaps you wrote something like money instead of finance, and they may actually only be looking for finance. So make sure that you're using the same language as the employer whenever possible. And for things like when you see a word mentioned multiple times, like marketing, the applicant tracking systems can actually track how many times a word shows up throughout your resume. And they will analyze how strong your resume is based on how many times a word shows up. So if a word shows up multiple times throughout the job description, that's a good hint that that word is probably more important than certain other ones. And you want to include that throughout your resume as much as you possibly can. In closing, I would love to introduce you to a helpful tool that you can use to undergo this process on your own. And that tool is JobScan. So JobScan is a website, and just like many other services, there are free aspects of the website, and there are things that you can pay for that are a little bit more in depth. But at its core, JobScan is a website in which you can paste your resume as well as paste in a job description that you want to apply for. And it will run through JobScan to give you feedback on how you can optimize your resume better for the job you're applying for. So I actually did that this morning with my own resume, and you can see here a couple of the pieces of feedback that JobScan offered. This is less than maybe a quarter of the feedback that JobScan offered to me, but it's awesome to be able to run your resume through this software, because software does a better job of reading what robots are going to look for than we do as humans, right? So on here, it told me some skills that are missing from my resume that would be needed for me to be successful in getting an interview for this job. It did check me off, telling me that I matched certain aspects like the education requirement, job title based on how many years I've been working, and that my format looks nice, which is great to hear, right? Later on, further down the page in my report, JobScan was able to tell me specifically, and this is just a portion of what they told me and which words. This went for much further of a scroll. They showed me which skills and which words were being evaluated potentially from this job description. So they were able to read the job description and see that the word education showed up a lot. So education they placed first, and luckily my resume has education written throughout it multiple times. So I was a good match on this part. Some of the words that were within the job description, however, did not show up in my resume. So even though I have worked in employment services for the last 3 years, I didn't use that language when describing my work. So I might go back into my resume and rephrase, I work within an employment services office at Temple University, instead of I work in the Career Development Center. That way, the computer has an easier time of reading my experience and knowing that I work in employment services, because it's pretty limited in being able to identify what language that we would use as humans, right? So I would recommend going on to JobScan as you're applying for jobs, uploading your resume, and uploading for each position the job description for that job. And you can check out what the free features are on there. There's a lot that it can offer you for free. And in addition, if you do choose to do the pay-to-play service, it sometimes knows extra information about your employer in particular, including which software that employer uses, to be able to give you more targeted feedback for the specific ATS that's being used at a company. So that may be worth you checking out as well. So that's all that I had for today, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for Q&A here, because I know that there's often questions that have to do with how to put your resume together. So at this time, we'll transition on to questions and answers.
So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to enter those in the Q&A box that is on Zoom, and then we will address those and hopefully be able to answer those questions for you. So we have one question here, and Bridget, you may see this too. But someone, Dave is asking, Any thoughts about combining a cover letter and a resume in one single document and uploading? Does the ATS system scan both of them?
That's a great question, Dave. So yes, the ATS system does scan both documents. So I'm glad that you brought that up. However, you don't want to put those two documents together. For any job that asks you for a cover letter, even if it's optional, I highly, highly recommend writing one, because you're doubling the space that you get to use to talk about your experiences and to tailor them to a specific job. So on top of your resume, your cover letter is almost always scanned through the same software. So the same rules here apply, right? You want to go through and make sure that your formatting is simple, that your keywords are integrated throughout. And this gives you a chance to go into a little bit more depth about one or two of your employment experiences or activities that fit. So when you're looking at this list of words that need to be integrated, if you did get to include a cover letter for your job search, these can also be part of your cover letter. But to answer your first question, no, you don't want to put those two documents together. They're still going to be separate.
Awesome. Dave also asked if, in regards to the application, if there is a question about salary and it's an open-ended question, is it okay to enter 0?
That's another good question, Dave. This is a really, really difficult question because different employers handle the salary requirement differently. From my own personal experience, there was one time that I wanted to make sure that I would be a good candidate for a position. So what I did was I entered a salary range, which is something that I would recommend if you do have an open field. I entered a salary range that was decently lower than what I actually wanted to be paid, because I didn't want to be kicked out by the applicant tracking system. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this. And why? Because when I finally received the offer from that company, they gave me a low salary. And when I tried to negotiate my salary with that employer, they said, well, on your application right here, I have it in my hands, it says that you would be willing to accept this amount of money, right? So that salary number is really important, but it's also really important that you're honoring truthfully what amount you want to be paid, because that salary number is going to be recorded all the way through your offer. What I would recommend is that you do your best to do your research and see what the different salaries are for that position, and see if you can make a guess based on that and based on what your requirements are, what salary you want to make. If the application doesn't force you to include an answer for that question, it may just be an information gathering, and it may not be a requirement or one of those questions that kicks you out of the process. So if that's the case, you don't necessarily need to enter a salary number, but oftentimes it will be a forced question, in which case typically you do want to enter that range. So anywhere from, say, 45,000 to 55,000. That way you're entering the lowest number that you would be willing to take, in addition to the number that you're shooting for, which is closer to 55. Good question, Dave.
Thank you, Bridget. We do have one other question that's sitting in our chat box here. So Kevin is asking, what are some of the top few reasons that bots will be kicking out resumes out of these systems?
That's a great question. So a few of the reasons that they're going to kick out candidates would include that their past experiences or job titles don't match the job title that the person is applying for. And so they're looking to hire somebody that basically, in a Venn diagram between that person's experience and this job, they want that middle section to be really full. So if the person has applied and they haven't put a lot of thought into making their resume fit for this specific position, they're going to get kicked out pretty quickly. So I would say that's the primary thing, is that the keywords don't match. And in the case that the keywords don't match, the employer will never get that resume in their hand.
Awesome, thank you. So I am going to leave this open for a couple more minutes, maybe about 2 or 3 minutes, if anybody has any additional questions. And then from there, we will go ahead and finish out with those questions and then go ahead and close out for the session. So we will keep it open until about 12:52. And then at that time, we will close out.
Sounds good to me. So I have some typical questions here. I'll see if there's any that we didn't cover. Again, so most of these questions are actually questions that we covered throughout the presentation. These are the most common questions that I get from students. You know, be careful with how long your resume is. Like I said, the 1-to-10 ratio is really important. As far as that professional summary goes, you want to make sure if you're including a professional summary, it's for a specific reason. If your work experience speaks for itself and already matches the position well enough, typically you don't need to include that summary. How far back should your resume go for folks that have been in the workforce for quite a while? Again, it doesn't need to be a professional history. So you can just include more recent work experiences that fit the job that you're applying for most. As far as color goes, do be careful depending on your field. Sometimes it's viewed positively and sometimes it's not viewed so positively. So take a look at other people's resumes in your field. And then for volunteer, part-time, and unpaid experience, all experience that you've had in your life is totally fair game for the resume. It does not matter if you were paid for your time or not. So if you have an awesome volunteer experience that shows your leadership skills, feel free to put that on your resume, either under experience or under activities.
So we do have an additional question here that just came in
Right.
from Brian. And he says, for a technical position, what are your thoughts on including an interest section for skills that aren't 100% developed, but the candidate wants to work on or expand upon?
That's a great question. So what I would generally say as far as technical skills go, one tendency is for people to try to quantify how much experience they have with something. And I would say be very careful with that. So for example, if you are looking to be a front-end web developer and you don't know a ton about C++, but you took a class on it and you did a class project at the end, go ahead and put it on your resume. I wouldn't necessarily feel like it needs to be quantified as low-level experience or intermediate. I typically just have people list out programs that they're familiar with. And that way, when the employer is bringing you in for an interview, they have the opportunity to ask you more about your level of experience. I would not necessarily, however, recommend putting just interests on your resume, because if you haven't played around with something and it shows up on your resume and you end up kind of in that final applicant pool, you may get eliminated if you don't have any experience on that. So I think it's okay to talk about your interests in an interview, but remember that your resume is supposed to be a marketing document that talks about things that you've done in the past. So it doesn't necessarily cover the future. But again, if you're in a technical field and you're noticing that a lot of different jobs are asking for a skill that you don't have, then I would recommend trying to hop into a class about it, even just doing some online tinkering around with it, taking a class on LinkedIn Learning. And that way you'll have the ability to put it on the resume and be an applicant for that skill.
All right, we have actually another question here too. So I think they're still coming in, which is nice. Thank you everybody for adding your questions here. So we have an additional question about when you're attending the interview, what kind of resume should you bring to that interview? For example, should it be heavier bound paper, stock paper, the color of the paper, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically when you are coming in for an interview, you're oftentimes going to bring at least the same document that you applied for a job with. That being said, if it's a couple months later and you have more things that you've done in those few months, feel free to actually update your resume within that time, because the paper copy that you give them can show any experience that you had between the time that you applied and the day that you're interviewing. best practice would be to go to like a Kinko's or go to your university career center if you're still a student and print your resume onto a nice resume paper, because it just looks nice and it shows that you put in some extra time and care. That being said, if you don't have access to that, just bring in a regular printed copy. It's not viewed negatively. I think it's just seen as stepping it up if you do happen to have that nicer resume paper.
Great, thank you, Bridget. So I think what we'll do is we'll start to close out for the session here. So again, thank you everyone for adding questions and your comments about the session. Feel free to add any questions as we begin to wrap this up if there's anything that comes to mind, and we will try to get those answered before 1 o'clock. So if not, that will conclude today's webinar session. Thank you again for everyone for attending and contributing to this conversation. I'd like to especially thank Bridget for presenting today. As a reminder, all Hen Talks are recorded and will be accessed by either you can visit the Hen Talks page of udconnection.com, or you'll able on the UD Career Acceleration Network platform on our resources tab, you will be able to access any and all of the Hen Talks sessions that we have done. We are always looking for ways to improve our programming. So if you have any suggestions, please feel free to email me directly at tjulian@udel.edu. I will also send a follow-up email about your feedback about this session. So feel free to respond to that email as well with any additional tips or thoughts you may have about how things have went today. So if there aren't any more questions, we'll go ahead and close up. I hope this webinar was helpful to everyone, and everyone have a great afternoon.